A very warm welcome to IDFC First Bank Presents Leaders of Tomorrow Season 11. I'm Ritwika Gupta, and here's wishing all our viewers a very happy Independence Day. Today we have a very special conversation lined up talking about the role of entrepreneurship, sustainability and innovation in shaping a self-reliant nation. I'll be speaking to Dr. Naushad Forbes, co-chair of Forbes Marshall and past president of CII, as he shares his insights for entrepreneurs that echo the spirit of progress and resilience. Joining me live right now is Dr. Naushad Forbes. Thank you for being on the show, Dr. Naushad.
Thank you. My pleasure.
So, as we celebrate Independence Day, let's start by talking about your perspective in terms of how the economic landscape of India has evolved since independence and what role does the private sector play in shaping the nation's progress?
So, whenever I describe the Indian economy, I always say that it's a private sector-led economy. And we're a private sector-led economy in many ways, and we'll talk about that, I'm sure, more as we go along. But we've been a private sector-led economy right from day one, right from post-independence. And sometimes we've been a private sector economy in spite of the best efforts of the government to change it, previous governments and current government. So it's good to think about it in those terms. So if you look at where we were in terms of the economy in 1947 as a newly independent country, a lot of enthusiasm, a lot of confidence, a lot of hope for the future. And industry had that same sense of patriotism that was in play across the country. And I think the investments that took place from industry at that time took place in that spirit of patriotism, in that spirit of really being part of the nation's progress in the long run. It was only in 1991 that the government under Narasimha Rao and Manmohan Singh really decisively broke with the past and moved in the direction of openness to the world in terms of allowing in imports, encouraging Indian firms to go overseas, and openness also in terms of the way in which industry was dealt with in the country, in that there was a move away from a complete move, a scrapping of industrial licensing. There were the restrictions that institutions like at that time, something called FERA used to place on Indian industry in terms of foreign transactions were essentially done away with. It was a decisive break with the past. And industry really flourished in the decades after 1991. And I think that opening up to the world and within the country continued from pretty well unbroken across governments from 1991, I'd say, till about 2017.
Dr. Naushad, how do you think the world perceives India today as a player on the international stage, especially in terms of innovation and technological advancements?
So, I think the world perceives India today very, very differently to the way it perceived India, say, in 1991, and for a very simple and good reason. In 1991, India did not matter to the world in economic terms. In population terms, we did, as a size of country, etc., and because of our history and culture, we did. But in terms of actual economic heft, we did not matter to the world in 1991. We were, I think, the world's 15th largest country, 15th largest economy. We were sort of on a par with a mid-ranking European country, one of many. Today, we're the 5th largest economy in the world. Every prediction says that we will soon be the 3rd largest because we're within shouting distance of Germany and Japan. And even a very modest rate of growth will take us past Germany and Japan in the next 3 or 4 years. The world sees India as a market. It sees India also as a potential valuable partner and supplier. Now, it sees it as a valuable partner and supplier for good reasons and bad reasons. The good reason is that whatever our government, we've been pretty well managed from a macroeconomic perspective in terms of broader financial policy, budget deficits, the way in which we manage our currency. We've been pretty responsible, including during the pandemic. And as a result, the economy is in decent macroeconomic shape. And that's the good reason that we're seen as an attractive place, an attractive economy. There are also bad reasons. The bad reasons is what's happened in the rest of the world. China seems to have done its best to make itself less attractive to the world through very authoritarian rule from Xi Jinping. You see much less interest of the world in expanding in China, and you see a real desire to develop this China plus one strategy. And India is in prime position to take advantage of both these good elements and bad elements, where a more attractive, more interesting destination for the world than ever, really.
So, our show Leaders of Tomorrow is also about empowering MSMEs, referred to as the backbone of the Indian economy. In what ways do you believe the growth and empowerment of MSMEs can contribute to the overall socio-economic development of the nation?
So MSMEs are a very important component of any economy, and especially any large economy. And they are for a few different reasons. First, it's how you get new firms. New firms start up as small firms, and some of those grow into big firms given the right environment and the right strategy over time. But MSMEs are also an important part of the economy because they tend to be very employment intensive. So for example, in India, MSMEs dominate the hospitality industry, the retail industry, the logistics industry, all of this, the tourism industry. All of these are high employment sectors. So MSMEs account for a very large share of employment in the country. And that is very crucial for an economy like ours that's consumption-led. Consumption accounts for about 60% of our GDP and also our GDP growth. And if MSMEs thrive, then so does consuming power by the wider part of society. And the wider economy does well as a result. Very often when we talk about MSMEs, we look at MSMEs as someone that needs help and assistance. I think that's wrong. I think what MSMEs need is a level playing field where they are enabled to thrive. As I've spoken to many, many small and medium firms across sectors, particularly in the manufacturing sector, what they're looking for is not subsidies and benefits. What they're looking for is the freedom to be able to succeed. Let me give you an example of what enables that. A large firm, when you have all of these license controls and the license Raj I spoke about earlier, a large firm develops a whole infrastructure to deal with those licenses. A small firm can't. For the small firm, it's the individual entrepreneur who ends up having to deal with all of that regulations. And that keeps the entrepreneur, keeps her or him from worrying about the business. So regulations, tying the firm up in all kind of regulatory knots, particularly is damaging for small firms. So if we want to enable small firms and enable them to thrive, the best way of doing so is actually ease of doing business. The best way of doing so is to get rid of regulations. I'll give you another example in terms of taxation. Very often we think in terms of incentives for small firms, but look at the way in which any kind of special tax incentives work. Who captures them? It's large firms. It's large firms that capture the benefits of reduced taxation for particular sectors, whether that sector is insurance or healthcare. It's a large firm that captures those benefits. It's large firms that capture the benefits of sales tax exemptions by locating in some mountainous area in the middle of nowhere. It's large firms that capture the benefits of things like the production-linked incentive scheme, which incentivizes producing certain items. It's mainly large firms that have participated, large Indian and foreign firms that have benefited from those subsidies. So all of those kinds of measures end up actually making it less of a level playing field for small firms.
Before slipping into a short commercial break, here's quickly telling you all about Brand Surge, a new initiative by Times Network. This is a unique opportunity for startups to be on TV without a TVC that can help you reach up to 25 crore viewers of Times Network through packages starting at only 1 lakh rupees. We at Times Network firmly believe in empowering startups with the tools and resources they need to succeed. For more information, log on to brandsurge.co.in. On that note, we'll take a quick break here. Back in just a moment. Stay tuned. Welcome back. You're watching our Independence Day special on IDFC First Bank Presents Leaders of Tomorrow Season 11, in conversation tonight with Dr. Naushad Forbes. How do you view the current state and potential future trajectory of India's manufacturing industry? What strategies do you believe are crucial for enhancing its competitiveness on a global scale while ensuring sustainable growth?
If you look at our manufacturing industry, manufacturing has accounted for the last 30 years, it's accounted for around 15%, 16% of GDP. And both the current government and the previous government had the target of raising manufacturing share in GDP to 25%. But in spite of a whole bunch of different things that have been done, it stayed at roughly 15 to 16%. So how come? What do we need to do? The best way of ensuring that manufacturing in the country thrives is if manufacturing industry itself becomes much more serious about innovation. Why do I say this? If you look at Indian manufacturing, our industrial structure in the country is more skill intensive and capital intensive than most countries at our level of development. If you compare ourselves and our industrial structure with an Indonesia, or with a China 20 years ago, or with a Vietnam even today, or with a Bangladesh, for example, we have a much more skill and capital intensive industrial structure. Indian industry needs to be much more serious about investments in in-house R&D. We can talk about government policy, we can talk about government incentives and all of that, but the work begins at home. It begins within Indian industry, and it's up to Indian industry to invest more in R&D for its own good. How much do we need to invest? Indian total in-house investment in R&D by Indian industry accounts for about 0.3% of GDP. That's 0.3% of GDP against a world average of 1.5%, and in China it's 1.6, 1.7%. In other words, in Indian industry, we need to scale our investments in R&D by at least a factor of 5. So at least 5 times more, right, to match the world in investments in R&D. The second element of building a thriving competitive industry is to see the world as our market. The Indian market is large, but it's still only about 3.5% of the world. So the world is another 96.5% of the entire market that's available to us. So even if we look just at ASEAN, at the Association of Southeast Asian Nations, the 10 countries that make up ASEAN, those 10 nations would double the Indian market. In other words, we can double our market by being much more engaged with trading and doing business just with ASEAN. Add the Middle East, add Africa, add Latin America.
So Forbes Marshall has a strong focus on sustainability. How do you think the principles of being Atmanirbhar and sustainability can guide industries towards a greener and self-reliant future?
One of our main businesses is energy conservation. And we've seen a great interest in energy conservation across the decades. And when we, as a firm, now do more and more business outside of India, I think we're actually in very good shape in India. And the reason we're in such a good shape is because Indian industry has never been subsidized in terms of energy costs. It's borne the brunt of high energy costs for years. And these high energy costs then result in industry wanting to constantly conserve and bring down its energy footprint. That's a very solid, good base to build off. So I'm very positive about where Indian industry is on this journey towards a much more sustainable, greener future.
Dr. Naushad, in India, education, skilling and upskilling have played critical parts, especially post-independence. Tell me, what reforms do you believe are necessary to enhance the quality of education in India and empower the youth to contribute meaningfully to the nation's growth?
There are two areas that we need to work when it comes to education and to some extent skilling. First is in school education. And the new education policy actually has a very sensible focus within school education on one metric. And that one metric is second standard outcomes, which says that every child coming to the end of their second standard should be able to read and do arithmetic at the second standard level. The second area is higher education. And for higher education, we need to deregulate in a massive way. We have a highly regulated higher education sector. We don't focus on the faculty. We focus on how many acres of land you need and how many square foot of space you need. I mean, free the sector, give the higher education sector its 1991 moment. It needs its 1991 moment that industry got, where we were free to become a major, successful, independent force. Higher education needs the same thing. So the state has a big role to play in primary education and second standard outcomes, especially the state governments. In higher education, the state's role is to get out of the way to a much greater extent than it currently occupies.
And finally, tell us, how can the spirit of Independence Day inspire entrepreneurs and business leaders to contribute to the growth and development of our nation? And what do you believe are the most important lessons that today's generation of entrepreneurs can learn from India's remarkable business evolution, especially over the last decade or so?
I think it's important to start with this basic premise that India is a private sector-led economy. If we're a private sector-led economy, we should expect much more of our private sector and expect more of our private sector in terms of investments in inclusion, so that our CSR work tries to do something about the primary education and school education outcomes that I spoke of earlier, that we encourage our industry to try to be more employment intensive so people get more and more in the way of good jobs, and that we go into sectors with a long-term horizon and see how we can develop businesses that are successful in the long run. Second, I hope that as industry, we remember our history. I hope that as industry, we remember that we went through this bad patch in the 70s of controls and regulation that tied the economy up in knots and delivered such lousy results. And we remember that as a way of keeping us from making the same mistakes again. I really worry about that today, because I worry that we're starting to think that a system where you have incentives and subsidies and protection and licensing is the way to get a thriving industrial sector. It's not. Our own history says it's not. And we should remember that when we decide either policies or decide what strategies in industry we want, or whether we in industry go to the government and say that this is the kind of changes and structure and reform that we need. We should remember our history and remember that actually by opening up the economy to the world and opening up our own domestic investments in more and more sectors so that firms are freed to operate independently and freely is the way for us to thrive and succeed. Indian entrepreneurship is second to none. The talent that we have in people is second to none. And we need to let that talent thrive, and we need to let entrepreneurs thrive. Happy Independence Day to everyone.
Well, thank you so much, Dr. Naushad. It was lovely chatting with you.
Thank you.
With that, it's a wrap on this episode of IDFC First Bank Presents Leaders of Tomorrow Season 11. Hope you enjoyed the conversation. Wishing you all a very, very happy Independence Day. Goodbye.